Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Philip Cook, who is Professor of Public Policy, Economics, and Sociology at Duke University. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and National Academy of Sciences. He is also director of the NBER Work Group on the Economics of Crime and co-editor of the NBER volume on crime prevention. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks for having me, Gill. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your older papers to set the context for our discussion. From 2013, the paper is entitled The Great American Gun War, Notes from 4 Decades in the Trenches. You say in this essay, you provide an account of how research on gun violence has evolved over the last 4 decades, intertwined with personal observations and commentary. I don't know much about this, Phil, and so could you set the context for how gun violence might have changed in the U.S. last 40, 50 years?
Sure. I think that my perspective on it is as a scholar and particularly as an economist, and my experience is then filtered through the peculiar perceptions that we researchers have. But what we've seen, I think, is that the United States has long been one of the most violent countries in the developed world, and that starting in the Vietnam era, there was a period where the homicide rate doubled. It stayed high for a couple of decades and then started dropping in 1993 and went back to where it was before that big upsurge. And so my career has spanned a period when the problem measured by the homicide rate has doubled and then halved, which is interesting. But I will say that the intensity of the debate about how we should regulate guns, which account for most of those homicides, that intensity has remained, and if anything, has become more virulent during that period of time.
So I'm surprised, Phil. So you're saying, so we had a decline in the 1990s, and we are back to where we sort of started in terms of homicide rates?
I could say that confidently. By 2014, we were back to where we were, say, in 1963. And there was this extraordinary crime drop from 1993 to 2014, not expected, not well explained, but it happened. And it was transformative in all the ways we would expect. The city that is Exhibit A for the effect of that crime drop is New York City.
Yeah.
And in New York, actually, the drop in violence was even more precipitous. And now New York is a relatively safe place to be. And that's true even in areas that used to be very problematic, like Harlem or the Bronx. And the effect has been that the city has grown in population and in wealth. You know, the property values have turned around, that it's really made a big difference during that period of time.
And so this is a phenomenon, as you say, we have been one of the most violent countries in the developed world. So this is not a phenomenon that happened anywhere else in the world, right? I know that Australia and Western Europe, I think the gun-related violence at least has been declining quite substantially.
Yes, I think Australia has been successful in reducing what was already a very low rate of gun violence, and that's been true in the United Kingdom and England through, among other things, regulation. But all the way along, their overall rates of serious violence were substantially lower than what we have in the United States. So I think that this is part of American exceptionalism, is that we have to deal with a greater threat from criminal violence than is true in Western Europe or Australia, or certainly in Japan or China, or even Canada right next door. And that's been part of the American experience. You know, whether, I mean, it hasn't been my job to try to understand that very fundamental relationship, but I will certainly endorse the idea that part of the deadliness of violence in America has to do with the widespread availability of guns. That's something that greatly exceeds any of the other countries that we're talking about.
I don't know what the statistics are exactly, but it's something like we have 3 guns per person or something like that in the US.
Well, it's not quite that bad. So the estimate that I liked as of a couple of years ago was 300 million guns total in private hands. And that works out to a bit more than 1 gun per adult. But
yeah,
it is true that in the last couple of years, and especially in 2020, there was a surge in gun sales, and it probably these days the total might be 330 million, something like that. But it's still on the order of 1 gun per person, and that's a lot. The thing to understand about that, besides the fact that it's a lot, is that the guns are not distributed uniformly across households, and that in fact most households have 0 guns in them in the US. So the high estimate is maybe 40% of households have 1 or more guns. But the households that have guns tend to have quite a few, and they average around 5 or more. And so I think it's fair to say that people who like guns tend to accumulate them, and some have arsenals of 20 guns or 50 guns.
Right. And so when you say violence, are you talking about violence in general, or are you talking about violence related to guns specifically?
Yeah, I think this is something that is missed in some of the international comparisons. It is certainly true that where the US really stands out is in terms of gun violence.
Yeah.
But even our non-gun homicide rate exceeds the rate that we find in any of the Western European countries or Canada or Australia or Japan by a wide margin. So I think it's fair that even if you removed guns from the scene, we would still have a somewhat higher rate of deadly violence, just with knives and clubs and so forth. But where we really excel is with gun violence.
Right. Yeah, we have had a lot of practice with it. And so if you think about this more like a disease, Phil, I don't know if it's the right analogy, but it seems to me that we have some sort of genetic proclivity to violence. Is that a reasonable assumption?
I mean, I can't imagine that it's a genetic explanation that we.
No, I didn't mean, kind of human genetic, but if you think about the system as sort of a social system, uh, the people in the US, are they more prone to violence for whatever reasons?
Um, it's a interesting question about whether you would see the people transplanted from the U.S. to Europe would continue to be relatively violent. But I think that in defense of Americans, it should be pointed out that even in America, the serious violence and the number of serious violence perpetrators tends to be quite limited, quite small. So it's not necessarily that we're all sharing in this disease, but that for whatever reason there is a larger group that is caught up in violent patterns, whether it's domestic violence or gang-related violence or just routine bar fights and that kind of thing, where they tend to drink too much and then get into fights. So hard to say what cultural explanation, what circumstantial explanation there might be that would really account for why we're different. And if you cross the border into Canada, that things get safer in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, but if we see the aggregate numbers to be higher in the US, and if you say the people engaged in violence and crime, let's say violence in general, if the numbers engaged are not necessarily high, then one has to conclude that the people who are engaged in violence are more efficient in doing that, and they do a lot more than other countries.
Oh, not necessarily. All I'm saying is that even though we do have more serious violence of all kinds, it's still mainly attributed to a small percentage of the population, and that would be true in other countries as well. And our percentage might be a bit higher than what we see in Western Europe. And incidentally, just to be clear, the comparisons that we are inclined to make are with other wealthy countries.
Right.
There are middle-income countries and low-income countries that have still higher rates of violence, and have to keep that in mind. That Central America has a much higher murder rate, for example, than the U.S.
Yeah, yeah. I can relate to that. I don't know if it is totally related to income, but maybe there are other factors. I grew up in India. I never have seen a gun or a gun-related crime when I was growing up, and so I suspect access to guns, and this is where I think our discussions will go in the next couple of papers. And I think this is one of your hypotheses. But before we get there, though, Phil, this drop in violence in the early 90s and subsequent retracing to the levels in 2014, do you have any hypothesis as to why that happened?
Well, I think that most accounts by criminologists would start with the crack cocaine era. And what we saw was the crack was introduced into American cities in the early 1980s, and it spread across the country. The distribution of crack tended to be associated with high rates of violence. It was being sold by gangs that often use teenagers as their street corner salespeople, that those teenagers were given guns and that to protect the stash, but ended up using them in all kinds of other ways, and the gangs became more violent. So there was a period through about the early 1990s when it does look like crack was playing a big role. Beyond that, there's no real agreement about what the ultimate cause was during that period, or why it turned the corner. Why did we start seeing such a dramatic drop in 1993? And all we can say is that in 1993, the criminologists were predicting a continued increase of violence, and there were horrific projections about how bad it was going to get. And of course, none of that happened, and in fact, the reverse happened. So it was more like a miracle than anything else, and I think that I would give some of the credit to improved policing and to cities waking up to what had to be done in terms of hiring more police. That was part of the situation in New York City and some of the other cities that have been studied. I unfortunately need to add that, it dropped, as I say, through 2014. Since then, it has been sneaking up a bit. And so we've seen, as of last year or 2019, there's been some increase in homicide and violent crime generally. But in 2020, the COVID year, the year of thousands of street demonstrations and what have you, we've seen an enormous spike in serious violence and in homicide. So a number of cities have experienced a 50% increase in homicide in 2020. So I would always say and have said that we didn't really understand why violence rates dropped so much in those decades. And that lack of understanding may doom us to repeat the increase that we experienced earlier. I hope that's not true, and that somehow this is just a one-off experience and it'll drop again.
Yeah, I mean, the factors one could think about, perhaps some sort of policy change in the early 90s. I know that was President Clinton. 90s have been generally, economically, the US was doing really well. I don't know if economic growth had an effect till we hit the air pocket in 2008. I don't know, are there environmental conditions we can potentially attribute to and policies?
Right. I wish I could offer a good explanation that was persuasive. I actually have studied the effect of economic conditions on violent crime and homicide, looked at the effect of the business cycle, and I think generally what we found is that the business cycle, the boom and bust cycle, has very little effect on the homicide rate. So there's what we know is that the 1990s were a time when drug use was trending down, that people were
Yeah.
drinking less, always a good thing when it comes to violence. And there was, more interest in healthy lifestyles and so forth. So there was a kind of a cultural change during that time. But hard to build that into a scientific explanation.
Yeah, I also wondered, I don't know anything about this, Phil. I also wondered if, there's some sort of a balancing, that happens on the system. In other words, is there an upper end of per capita violence that a system can sustain when it hits those upper ranges? For whatever reasons, you tend to mean revert. Do we have any reason to believe something
Yeah, I
like
mean,
that?
I think one place you can point is that there's certainly is both private and public adaptation to the threat of crime. At the public level, there's political support for expanding the police and the criminal justice system, and that has some effect, especially the police, in reducing crime. And at the private level, we see a proliferation of private cameras, surveillance systems, people living in kind of withdrawing from normal social interaction and finding ways to protect themselves. Businesses hiring more guards, setting up business improvement districts, and so forth. So there is, for better or worse, both a public and a private response that may happen with some lag. And in this case, I think that, in early 1990s, both sectors were very concerned about crime, and the cities were going downhill. It was a desperate situation, and there was a response that may have accounted for some of the success in turning the corner.
Yeah, I mean, one concerning thing, as you mentioned, is this uptick and significant increase in the last couple of years. Maybe taking COVID as a cover to increased violent activities. It's problematic, right? It's you can't really focus on it because the society has other things to worry about.
You can't focus on it, and it wasn't clear exactly what was going to be the response of COVID, since COVID included many different changes in the way we live, starting with a deep economic depression. And as I say, I don't think that matters a great deal in normal times, but also the changes in people's routine activities and how they interact with each other. But it also had the effect of making the police back off, and
Yeah.
I think that they didn't want to get sick and mix it up with people on the sidewalks, or even stopping cars, and so that there may have been some disengagement on the part of the police that didn't help. It's could have gone either way, but sadly, at the same time, that we saw other types of crime going down, we saw this enormous explosion in lethal violence and homicide. If you look at the burglary rate or the robbery rate, many fewer break-ins, for example. People are staying home, defending their property. So it was not a good time to be a burglar, but the gangs were very active out on the street.
Right. And the good case of New York can be contrasted against sort of the bad case of Chicago, and it seems like Chicago has gone in the other
I mean,
direction.
Yeah, Chicago's one
Um,
of the cities that
yeah,
had a 50% increase in homicide last year. It's just unbelievable. I mean, it is such a huge change in violence that happened all of a sudden.
yeah. Yeah, we'll take a quick break, Phil. When we come back, we'll focus very much on your research area, which is guns, um, the type of guns, availability, regulations, public policy, and this is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. We're back. Phil, we were talking about violence in general, why the US statistics appear to be sort of an outlier compared to other Western countries, other developed countries in terms of aggregate violence. And you have done a lot of research in this area, especially uh, how guns could have an impact on overall violence in society. So you have a paper, Understanding Gun Violence, Public Health versus Public Policy. And you have mentioned in this paper that the statistics that we use to measure gun violence, maybe it's not sufficiently robust to think about policy. You want to talk a bit about that paper and what your thinking is?
Yes, I'd be glad to. 20 years ago, I published a book with Jens Ludwig called Gun Violence, the Real Costs, which was a sustained effort to try to understand what kind of problem gun violence is and how serious it is.
Yeah.
And it seemed like that understanding was the first step to acting effectively against it. So it was very much our interest in improving policy that led us to do that research. And what we said in the book, and what we and I have continued to say, is that the normal way that the problem gets characterized leaves us short of a good understanding of the full problem. So the usual way that we hear when people want to say that guns are a problem is they report on the number of people killed and how they are killed by guns. And of course that's helpful. It's the beginning of wisdom. But what it ignores is the fact that, especially for guns used against other people, for homicide and for assault, much of the problem has to do with avoiding becoming a victim. And it's this cost of avoidance or of minimizing the damage that should also be taken into account. If you look at neighborhoods of big cities, for example, that have high rates of gun violence, what you see is that there has been a long period of disinvestment, that people who have the means to leave do leave. They don't want to be there. Right. Because it's too dangerous. And so it becomes a problem not just for individuals who are shot, but also for the entire community, that it contributes to its poverty and is difficult to turn around. It contributes to the fact that the children living there are traumatized by the sounds of gunfire and by perhaps even witnessing victims. And that businesses that could employ the people living there typically don't move in because of the risk associated with violence. So that's the perspective, to say it's not just counting up the bodies, but also we need to take into account all of the efforts of avoiding violence and what the consequences of those efforts are for the community. And I would point to the close parallel to how we understand the COVID-19, the epidemic,
Right.
because there, of course, we can say, well, the problem is 350,000 people have died. And that is certainly a very important aspect of the problem. But the other half of it is that there have been such serious economic and social dislocations from people trying to avoid becoming infected. And so the fact that we had Depression era unemployment rates, that hundreds of thousands of small businesses have closed down, that the food insecurity rates have gone through the roof, and on, all have to be taken as part of the problem of COVID. Just so that's the analogy I think that would speak to us right now. If you live in a neighborhood that has high rates of gun violence, the effect is pervasive. It's not just for people who happen to be the direct victims, but it's all of the knockoff effects have to be taken into account.
Yeah, it's very, very analogous, as you say. And there is another dimension, Phil, which is also parallels this problem, and that is, in healthcare, sometimes we call it disease burden. And the disease burden is not just mortality, not just, sort of the tactical measurements of what people have gone through, but rather long-term effects of a disease. For instance, 1918 Spanish flu, millions of people had Parkinson's disease even after surviving that. And so the disease burden for society is substantially more than what the tactical measurements would imply. And in the case of guns, it's a similar situation, right? Just like you say, when trouble starts, cities, areas in a city could essentially over a long period of time could vacate because people just can't survive there. And so, yeah, the long-term effects are just potentially much more significant than what we are tactically measuring.
Yes, I like the term disease burden, and I think that it's right, and that the community decays in response to violence simply because people who have the choice don't want to be there. They don't want to have to listen to gunfire at night or to expose themselves to the elevated risk that's associated with that. And that's going to have as I say, a series of effects. What it is in a nutshell is that gun violence becomes a community development problem. And for a country, like famously Colombia a decade ago, for example, or the Central American countries, it's a national development problem that the international businesses don't want to locate there because of the high rates of violence and gang violence and so forth. But for us, it's located at the community level, and it has systemic effects. We know, for example, that even just by some definition of direct victim, we would want to include the children who are traumatized by being witnesses or being associated with gun violence victimization. We're seeing very good studies now on mass shootings in schools and how the students who didn't see anything have in many cases become traumatized by that. And so it is also true for these communities that year in and year out have a very highly elevated rate of violence.
Yeah, so I wondered, Phil, from a policy perspective, is the data and statistics fairly obvious? I'm just thinking that I know that Australia had sort of a similar problem. They have taken very severe actions against guns, regulation, availability of guns, the type of guns that can circulate, and you can see a significant drop in gun-related violence, right? And so couldn't we contrast? I mean, we have experiments now run by different countries, and there isn't a significant cultural difference between, let's say, US and Australia. And if we see the results of an experiment like that, couldn't we conclude that that is what's going to happen to us if we take similar actions?
Yes, I think that the Australian experiment is certainly relevant and interesting. The problem is that while there's a lot of similarity between Americans and Australians, a lot of overlap, one way in which it's different is in the politics. And so the National Rifle Association is powerful in the United States, powerful politically, and so that it's impossible to take the kind of action that was taken following the Port Arthur massacre in 1996 in Australia. And so, for better or worse, we don't have the option of doing what they did at the time. And remember, what they did was basically to ban semi-automatic rifles and shotguns. They had already sharply restricted handguns. And not only did they ban the semi-automatic rifles that can be where you can shoot multiple rounds just by a trigger pull without cocking or loading, but they also had a national buyback program, and so they ended up accumulating 1 million of these guns and destroying them. So all of that, plus the fact that Australia is sort of an island, and made for a remarkably effective measure. And one result is that there have been no more mass shootings in Australia since that time, and just all those years, and this has to be part of the explanation.
Right. And what's puzzling to me, at least, is that something like 80-90% of the US population are open to higher levels of regulation, background checks, and so on. I don't know a lot about it. Just reading online and things like that. So you can correct me if this is not true. But as you say, we have a very powerful organization, and just the existence of the NRA would disallow any changes to the system. If that's the case, even if 80-90% of the people are willing to make changes, then I don't know what the choices are for the country.
And the lack of choice becomes even more serious to the extent that the Second Amendment plays a role, and that we might see the U.S. Supreme Court declaring a larger domain for the Second Amendment freedoms and rights that would actually preempt some of the controls that we do have in place now at the federal or state level. So that remains to be seen, but it doesn't look good for given the composition of the Supreme Court that we have right now. I think what happened politically, though, even outside of the Second Amendment issues, has been that the Republican Party, for whatever reason, began to align itself with the National Rifle Association. And the two, in terms of their positions, became almost indistinguishable when it came to discussions of regulating guns. And so that, of course, greatly amplified the leverage that the National Rifle Association had and has had over the years. And so there we are, for better or worse. Fortunately, there are some areas that there is sometimes bipartisan support, and that we have seen action always at the state level. One of them, for example, is the red flag laws, the extreme risk protection orders that allow family members to go to a judge and request that guns be removed from the home because one of the members of the family looks like they're decompensating or having a mental health crisis, or in some way are at great risk of committing suicide or of shooting somebody else. And those laws are being adopted in red states, so to speak, in some cases, and might spread. But you're right. Nationwide, the is often registered at 80% or more, and yet Congress has been unwilling or unable to move in that direction. And instead, I think it's more likely that we'll go the other direction.
Yeah, it has to be they're unable, right? I mean, if everybody is calling their representatives, to be unwilling to take up the case cannot be sustainable in a democracy, I would imagine.
Right. Well, we'll see. I think that in most recent time that Congress acted decisively to strengthen gun regulation was in 1994 with the Brady Act. And since then, the 26 years since then, there hasn't been much along those lines. So the usual analysis, I'm not a political scientist, I must confess, but the usual analysis has been that while those who support the NRA and oppose gun regulation constitute a minority of the electorate, they're a very intense and disciplined minority. And they often treat gun issues as their top priority. They are perhaps the only issue that they care about when they vote, whereas other people may support more gun regulation, but they also support 20 other things and then have to choose among the available candidates in terms of the whole mix of issues.
Right. Yeah, it seems like we have set of constraints. Perhaps there may be other ways to think about. So I want to close with, Phil, your essay, Thinking About Gun Violence. You recently received the Stockholm Prize along with Frank Zimmerman. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You couldn't actually go to Sweden, I would imagine, right?
Right. They canceled the ceremony last June, and there is some talk about having it this coming June, but I think it's unlikely. But so it goes.
Yeah. And so this essay, if you were to look forward based on all the research you have done, everything you have seen, what is the likely path for the U.S.? I know that it's not going to be quick based on all the constraints we already talked about. But what's the likely path for the U.S. to at least move toward more more civilized form of society. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think that there's much that can be done about regulating guns or restricting their design or their distribution, uh, and or even the way they're carried or where they're carried. That's going to be very difficult, and I suspect we will see the traditional rules in those areas will be eroded over time, as I say, because of the Supreme Court and because of the ongoing politics of the situation. So I think where that leaves us is with for a systematic policy in this area is going to be better policing of gun violence. And I think that in this respect, I certainly am swimming upstream. I think it's fair to say they just in the year then we've heard a demand that we defund the police. My my proposal would be that we strengthen the police effort, at least when it comes to holding violent criminals accountable. So what we've seen is that in many cities, there's a very low arrest rate for shooting somebody. I mean, the likelihood in Chicago dropped as low as 5%. And in 2016 for non-fatal shootings. And so what it means is that the criminals have almost impunity in a situation like that.
Is it because they can person or there is some?
Excuse me, say it again.
It's because they cannot find the shooter or something else.
I think that often finding the shooter is not a problem because the shooter goes to the emergency department of the local hospital in almost every case, and that they are reported as having a gunshot wound. The police can arrive and interview them. But often the victim is not cooperative with the police investigation. And so they say that they are not going to cooperate, that they're going to take care of it themselves. And the result is the police can't get anywhere with the investigation, or it's difficult without a lot of extra effort. The police these days are swamped with these cases. And so they need to get on to the next one, is what it amounts to. And you set up this vicious circle of violence begetting violence. The victims seek revenge, and so it goes. And I think that to cut into that really does require that police give higher priority to the most serious kinds of violence. And that they invest in the technology that's available now that would help them, and the training and simply the numbers of detectives that are needed to get a hold of this, and that will begin to stop the bleeding. And I think that that's the place we have to start. We can also look at all kinds of other programs that might mean that the youths are not so inclined to join gangs and to cause trouble, starting with summer jobs programs and that kind of thing. But I think without accountability, without a high arrest rate, it's going to be hard to make anything work in this area.
Right. I wondered, Phil, do states have any autonomy? If the federal laws are going to be stagnant, can a state go ahead and implement its own policies, or that will be challenged in the Supreme Court?
I think right now we do see quite a bit of variety in terms of state laws, and almost any area that you want to consider, whether it's banning assault weapons or limiting concealed carry of guns or open carry, whether it's these extreme risk protection orders that I was talking about, that all of those are present in some states and not in others. My state of North Carolina has had since 1921 or so a requirement that if you're going to buy a handgun, you have to get a permit from the local sheriff. And that law remains on the books, and I think it actually does some good along the way. But again, you don't see that in most states. And I think that where the Gun Control Act of 1968 left things was to try to protect the states from each other, is what it amounted to, by limiting the circulation of guns across state lines, and then allowing the states effectively to move ahead with their own regulations. Certainly, though, the Constitution and the Second Amendment rulings could easily apply at the state level as well as the federal level. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, so since we have, I don't know if it is 50 different experiments going on, but close to that, can we actually look at how the per capita rates are differing in different states? Would that give us some insight?
I think so, and that has been a lot of my research, was looking at how states or cities differ from each other and how they change over time, and try to understand the role of, for example, gun availability in influencing gun crime. And so early on, my main finding was that cities that had a high prevalence of gun ownership had a high rate of gun use in robbery and in other violent crime. That may not sound too surprising, but what it says is that the criminals are being affected directly by the environment of gun availability that they're in. And if they live in Boston, it's much harder to get a gun than if they live in Phoenix. There just is such a big difference in terms of the percentage of households that own a handgun, for example. Probably 50% versus 5% in that case. And that makes a difference. And we've seen that when areas, states particularly, increase gun prevalence, then the homicide rate goes up. And so that becomes part of the story, is just to look at the ownership of guns and how the legitimate ownership of guns leaks into the illegitimate sector and makes guns available to gang members and to violent criminals. That's been an important finding. There's also been a number of studies looking at the effect of specific regulatory change that I and others have done, and we can learn some lessons from that. One lesson, by the way, is passing a law is not enough. You also have to enforce it. And often, sadly, the laws are passed and there's no enforcement following it, and so it is ineffective. So there it is.
Yeah, I mean, it has long been discussed. As you say, not a lot of action last 20, 25 years. But hopefully this is something that the next administration can take.
Yes, and I think that they will do what they can. And we have to see how things go in Georgia. If both Democratic candidates win there and the Senate is organized by the Democrats, then I think at least there's a chance of modest measures coming out of Congress. And that meanwhile, as you say, that the states can proceed, if they're so inclined, with their own regulations, and unless and until such time as the Supreme Court expands the Second Amendment ruling.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Phil. Thanks so much for
Yeah,
spending time
I
with me
appreciate
today.
it. Interesting to talk to you about these issues that I've been struggling with for the last 45 years. So there it is.
Yeah, extremely important.
Okay, take care.
Thanks again.
Bye.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.